Okay, so I'm Tim Marshall. I'm the Provost of the New School, and it's a great delight to welcome you this evening to our keynote address for the Feminine Mystique at 50 Symposium. And it's fantastic to see such a large turnout, because I gather we had a pretty good problem in the fact that we had to relocate the venue because we had such a high turnout for this event, which is really fantastic. And I do hope that many of you were able to attend today's panels and will be returning tomorrow for the panels then. And also that you'll get out to see the exhibition at the Aronson Galleries and the Parsons Building, which is on 15th and 13th, 5th Avenue, and 13th Street. And it's been curated by Natalie Balthrop and Deborah Engel, who are both alums of our Parsons Cooper Hewitt Master's Program in the History of Decorative Arts and Design. So I really recommend that you go see that if you get half a chance. I will first want to extend my congratulations and gratitude to Laura Riccio. Where are you, Laura? Up there, up the back. And to Claire Potter, sitting right here, for organising these events, and to their colleagues from across the university who shared in this effort. This program came together with the support of more offices and departments, organisations and individuals than would be practical for me to mention, because there's over a dozen of them. But it has brought together the voices and perspectives of external scholars, the New School faculty members, students and alumni, and it's connected to half a dozen courses in the program. And this is precisely the kind of collaborative intellectual project that reflects the New School's intellectual profile, a cross-disciplinary interrogation of an issue that connects history and future, society and culture, art and design, and humanities and social research. This program also reflects the New School's legacy as a progressive institution that has been part of shaping higher education in this country. In 1963, the same year that the Feminine Mystique was published, Gerda Lerner, who died last week at the age of 92, earned her bachelor's degree at the New School for Social Research. Even while she was still a student, Lerner began teaching a course here. The course was called Great Women in American History, as one of the first courses on women's history in the US. A few years later, in 1966, Lerner joined forces with Betty Friedan and others to form the National Organization for Women. Lerner and Friedan heard and amplified the voices of women who were dissatisfied with the limitations of domestic life and whose intellectual and creative capacities were being stifled. They questioned educational systems that had predetermined a very limited range of what counted as a suitable education for women. And they were willing to take risks to lead change. So how very fitting it is to take a fresh look at these themes here at the New School in 2013. So I'm delighted to welcome Claire Potter, Professor of History at the New School for Public Engagement, who will now introduce the keynote speaker, Susan Ware. So Claire, thank you very much.
Welcome, everyone. I am tasked with an announcement, which is to say that the reception after this keynote speech is at the exhibition space, which is located at 66 5th Avenue between 12th and 13th Street. And it starts at 7 o'clock or as close to 7 as we get there. I am pleased, and really pleased, to be able to introduce our keynote speaker, Susan Ware. Currently the general editor of American National Biography, Susan has taught at New York University, Harvard University, and MIT, and she was the general editor for Volume 5 of Notable American Women, the premier biographical dictionary in American women's history. She is also the sole author of 11 books. Yes, 11. Susan's intellectual accomplishments stretch from politics to the history of media, culminating in a 2011 volume that focuses on Title IX and the impact of athletics on popular feminism. Game, Set, Match, Billie Jean King and the Revolution in Women's Sports, which you can buy at our book fair in the Teresa Lang Center on your way out. I have known Susan since she became my dissertation advisor in 1986. Something she might have perhaps thought twice about had she known that almost 30 years later she would still be writing me letters of recommendation. It is not for nothing that Renee Romano, my collaborator, and I dedicated our recent edited collection to our mentors. It is from women like Estelle Friedman and Susan Ware that we learned our craft and learned to be women historians as well as women's historians. But I also think I'm in a position to say that in a day and age when women are still debating Betty Friedan's questions about what women want, that Susan has, in fact, managed to do it all. She had a successful career on the tenure track. She has become a popular and widely read independent scholar. She has populated the Northeast and beyond with several generations of successful students. She has directed major projects like Notable American Women and the ANB, and all the while, with help from her husband and first reader, Don Ware, she has raised a succession of enormous, friendly, and cheerfully ill-behaved Béarnese mountain dogs. One of Susan's great intellectual contributions to the field of history has been to tenaciously insist on the importance of women's lives during a period in which gender, sexuality, feminist, transgender, disability, and queer studies have expanded the initial task of women's studies beyond its activist roots in movement feminism. This transformation from an initial project by which feminist scholars reimagined the past, initially through recovering lost histories, and then through a method we sometimes snarkily called Add Women and Stir, has been crucial to revising early feminist interventions and to the emergence of new activisms and new objects of study. Moving beyond women has made it possible to see the flaws in Betty Friedan's feminine mystique that jump off the page now. Its blindness to race, its high focus on an educated middle class, its homophobia, and its confusing vision that women could choose to be simultaneously attached and detached from the burdens of marriage and family. And yet, I would like to take this moment to point out that, as dated as some aspects of the feminine mystique are to 21st century eyes, Betty Friedan's belief that women are under-recognized and underserved sparks our students for good reasons. As the study of gender seems to make the study of women obsolete, Susan Ware's work reminds us that there are so many women who are well known to us and whose feminist struggles moved us forward as a nation, but whose lives are as yet unwritten. If there are 5 documentaries, multiple articles, and 5 full-length books that take the heroic Paul Robeson as their subject, there is one published last year by Barbara Ransby of Robeson's wife Eslanda, an anthropologist, transnational feminist, and anti-colonial activist in her own right. If we look at Betty Friedan's contemporaries, there are no scholarly biographies of Bella Abzug, Patsy Mink, Shirley Chisholm, Dolores Huerta, Geraldine Ferraro, Coretta Scott King, Pat Schroeder, or Althea Gibson. And after a prolonged search, I was able to come up with exactly one biography of any Asian American woman. And need I say that a country that has not yet become a signatory to the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, now 3 decades old, a country which can send women into combat but cannot pass an act guaranteeing equal pay or an equal rights amendment, should not be allowed to stop thinking about women? Like Betty Friedan, Susan Ware has never stopped thinking about women. This and the arc of her work that explores the expansion of feminist ideas beyond a set of core activists and to a broader public, whether during the New Deal or in the 1970s, is the reason we have invited her here today. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you, Claire, for that introduction, which I will have to try to live up to, I guess. I hope I do. And I'd also like to thank everyone involved in this conference today. A lot of work that has gone into it, and I'm just delighted to be here, and I'm delighted to see all of you here, and very much look forward to continuing the conversation later this evening and also tomorrow. So I thought I would set the stage by offering a few personal recollections, starting with my first memory of the Feminine Mystique. I was 12 years old when it was published in 1963, and I remember overhearing my mother and my aunt, who were both Wellesley-educated housewives living in a Tony Chicago suburb, talking about that book. More specifically, how they would never read that book. Now, my interest was immediately piqued, but mainly because I concluded they were referring to what used to be called a dirty book. Of course, when I finally did read The Feminine Mystique, I was quite amused at my initial misimpression. Now, the next encounter with the book occurred during my sophomore year in college. It was 1970, and I was just a few years too late to have participated in the heady early days of the civil rights movement, the beginnings of the anti-war movement, or the nascent consciousness raising that propelled women's liberation. Plus, frankly, the campus of Wellesley College wasn't exactly a hotbed of radicalism. I marched, I protested, but mainly I read, which was how I encountered the powerful ideas of modern feminism that would literally change my life. 3 books in particular set me off on my feminist journey, all of which I read in that year, 1970. Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, Doris Lessing's The Golden Notebook, and you can probably see this coming, Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex. And I mention this because it foreshadows one of the themes of my talk today, the power of books to act as agents of social change and personal transformation. So let's start with the book itself and ask ourselves, what did it get right? And just importantly, what did it get wrong? I think on the plus side, the first thing to notice is how well attuned to the times it was. As Stephanie Kuntz put it recently, books don't become bestsellers because they are ahead of their times. They become bestsellers when they tap into concerns that people are already mulling over. Now, Friedan cleverly identifies a problem that has no name, phrase from the book, and then she promptly names it. She calls it the feminine mystique, which she defines as, and this is the quote from the book, the highest value and only commitment for women is the fulfillment of their own femininity, end of quote. But that phrase, the feminine mystique, was sufficiently open-ended that it could stand in for a whole range of female discontent. And soon it had become a catchphrase, and I think it still functions in that way today. But one of the things I want to emphasize, because I think in this audience probably some of you have read the book and many of you haven't or just sort of know about it, is that this is not your usual frothy bestseller. The Feminine Mystique weighs in at almost 375 pages of text, plus footnotes, jam-packed with references to psychology, sociology, history, and other disciplines. One way to think of it is as a crossover book whose dynamic and accessible style and compelling story manages to translate serious material into a narrative for a popular audience. And for the women who were primed to accept the book's message, it acted like a national consciousness-raising session, or in Daniel Horowitz's apt phrase, self-knowledge obtained in the company of women. And this turned out to be a very powerful combination. Now, Betty Friedan honed her writing skills as a journalist. In fact, for the very women's magazines she so savagely skewers in her book. And that skill is on full display in the book. The prose is powerful and compelling. You remember phrases and anecdotes. And I think a good example of that is her justly famous opening, which I will read to you. The problem lay buried, unspoken, for many years in the minds of American women. It was a strange stirring, a sense of dissatisfaction, a yearning that women suffered in the middle of the 20th century in the United States. Each suburban wife struggled with it alone as she made the beds, shopped for groceries, matched slipcover material, ate peanut butter sandwiches with her children, chauffeured Cub Scouts and brownies, lay beside her husband at night. She was afraid to ask even of herself the silent question, is this all? That's a great way to open a book. Why? Because it's personal and it draws the reader in. It invites them to think about what is going to come in terms of their own lives. It makes you want to keep reading. And millions of women, and men too, did just that. Now here's some other things that, in retrospect, I think the Feminine Mystique got right. It offers a forceful critique of post-war consumer culture and advertising, which, as we heard in the panel before, depended on motivating housewives to buy more things for the home. And one way to do that was to use sex to sell products, or in the phrase of one advertising manifesto, to put the libido into advertising. And I would, if you pick up a copy of The Feminist Mystique, I would point you or your students to the chapters entitled The Sexual Cell and The Sex Seekers, and then read them against the television series Sex and the City, which endorses many of the marketing myths, such as finding happiness by buying more shoes and having more orgasms, that Friedan debunked. Be a great conversation to have in the classroom. Another one of the things I think really has stood the test of time is one of my favorite takeaway phrases is the chapter title, also mentioned earlier, Housewifery expands to fill the available time. And this is so very true, and it's not just when it comes to housework and homework, housework. If you've got 4 hours to fill, that's how long you'll take. But if you have 2 hours and something more interesting to do beyond that, you'll get the same work done in half the time. And I found this concept incredibly useful when I was writing this keynote. Kept me on track. I think we also need to give Friedan credit for her application of what we now would call a gender analysis of the field of psychology. She's trained as a psychologist, and she's basically asking why the studies are always of men and what would it happen if we thought of women as human too. And Friedan actually wrote a 1960 article entitled Women Are People Too, as if that needed to be said. But embedded in her critique of psychology, her gender analysis of psychology, was also a critique of the rampant Freudianism of the post-war world, which was providing critical reinforcements to the tenets of the mystique that Friedan was challenging. And I think that this was an important point that she was making. I think we also should give her credit for her critique of post-war women's education, with its emphasis on turning out well-adjusted wives and mothers. Some of you will remember the phrase, the MRS degree, Mrs., and how misguided that is compared to encouraging women to think independently. And I think that engagement of what education can mean to all people is an important part of the book. And finally, what Friedan called the mistaken choice between meaningful work and a satisfying family life is pretty much the struggle that women, as well as men, have been engaged in ever since. The problem hasn't been solved, but she helped to identify and popularize it. So that's a pretty positive assessment of a book published 50 years ago. And yet, if you spend time with the book, reading it or teaching it, there are quite a few negative factors and some real cringe moments that need to be entered into the equation. For example, modern readers immediately notice how impressionistic the evidence is. Just as telling, the evidence has been cherry-picked to point up the dissatisfactions of 1950s housewives without presenting any contrasting evidence of the satisfaction that many women found in their admittedly hectic lives. And I first noticed this back in the 1980s in a paper, which was actually for another New School conference, which I think is a nice link, where I went back, and as Laura Shapiro mentioned, I went back and I looked at the 1957 class reunion questionnaires, which Friedan had collected, and compared the generally upbeat view of these women's lives that she published in the Smith Alumni Quarterly in 1961 with the much more negative view of her classmates' lives, and by extension, all suburban women's lives in the final book. And so the question is, well, what had changed? It's not the Smith women, they hadn't changed, but it's the need to make it a simpler, starker story for the popular audience she hoped to reach. And she knew she wanted to do that, and she actually did. But I think in a way that very much undercuts its value as a historical description of women's lives. An even greater omission is the total lack of attention to the lives of working class women and or African American women. And this was really brought home to me the first time I taught the book at NYU in the mid-1980s to undergraduates who were often the first in their families to go to college. And to them, the portrait of bored suburban housewives was literally as foreign as a portrait of women on Mars, or is it Venus? Which is it? Men, whatever it is. It just didn't connect. It was like, who are these women? People live like this? And it was, for me, a real eye-opener. I already knew that, but it was an interesting, again, then it was an interesting way to teach the book and to engage that conversation. But the exclusion of black women is especially telling, since their wage participation rate in the 50s and 60s was much higher than that of white women. In other words, they actually provide a good model of how to combine work and family, one which Friedan chose to ignore. And as a corollary, Friedan's insistence that the key to women's growth was creative work denigrated the possibility that working class women might find their jobs meaningful and fulfilling too. What you get in the Feminine Mystique is the world from the perspective of privileged middle-class white women, and not even all of them. Now, there are a few other aspects that have not stood the test of time well. One that sticks out to me as a historian is Friedan's unwillingness to acknowledge her intellectual debts, among them to Simone de Beauvoir, Mira Komorowski, the path-breaking sociologist of gender, Vance Packard, who wrote about consumer culture in the 1950s, and, this is kind of a stretch, but I've always seen a thread of Charlotte Perkins Gilman in the Feminine Mystique as well, which is unacknowledged and may not even exist. Definitely demerits for Friedan on homosexuality, as in, here's a quote, "the homosexuality that is spreading like a murky smog over the American scene," end quote. And there are many other equally insensitive comments like that throughout the book. And so pervasive was Friedan's homophobia that to this day, often lesbians and some women I talk to refuse to go near the book. They just can't abide it. There are problems with Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex in a similar ways. Something that I think is always struck me as being profoundly overdrawn was her comparison of the lives of American suburban housewives to the progressive dehumanization of inmates in German concentration camps. There are many overstatements like that in the book, and I think we need to call her on them. There's also a rather mean-spirited attack on Margaret Mead, whose animus I have never quite figured out. And I think at one point Friedan says, well, basically, if we just looked at the life Margaret Mead lived, that would be fine. Just don't listen to what she's saying. But still, there's something about the way she goes after her that has always kind of puzzled me. Then there's the incredibly lame final chapter, A New Life Plan for Women, which basically holds out the prospects for creative jobs that don't really exist, and a call for adult education as a cure for all ills. Note the complete absence of any discussion of women's legal and political rights. In Friedan's telling, the problem is individual, and growth and change have to come from within. This focus on individual solutions to what we recognize as societal problems is in fact linked to the book's liberal feminist agenda, and I will return to that at the end. So I'll let you draw up your own balance sheet about the book, but even if you find it lacking, as many do, it is still important to try and analyze why it seemed to cause such an earthquake, and that's the phrase that Gail Collins used recently, when it came out. And clearly the early 1960s were a moment in American popular culture and the history of publishing when a serious book really could go what we now call viral. And this was alluded to earlier, but in addition to the Feminine Mystique, think also of Jane Jacobs' The Life and Death of American Cities, which was published in 1961, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, published in 1962, Michael Harrington's The Other Americans, also 1962, and Ralph Nader's Unsafe at Any Speed, 1965. And having mentioned Rachel Carson, I can't resist an aside in memory of the recently deceased and much mourned feminist history pioneer Gerda Lerner, who wrote in a 1963 letter to Betty Friedan I found at the Schlesinger Library, "You have done for women what Rachel Carson did for birds and trees." The joys of archival research. You just really, when you find something like that. All these books dealt with serious issues that grew out of the contradictions of post-war consumer culture, the fate of our cities, the environment, consumer protection, poverty, and feminism. Each helped spark a national conversation that is still going on today. So in that sense, Betty Friedan was in very good company. But we don't need to keep so close to the actual book itself. In fact, I think that the significance of the book, especially how its main tenets entered popular culture and popular imagination, probably exceeds anything it actually said or the numbers of people who have actually managed to get all the way through it. And so I think it's also just as fruitful to use the book as a stepping stone or jumping off point for some broader questions, of which I would like to focus on 4. First is the gap between Betty Friedan's portrayal of herself as just a housewife and her actual life. Second is what the book meant to individual women. The third is the question of whether it caused the women's movement. Obviously not, but there's more to say there. And fourth, its place in the history of feminism. And I will try to be brief and I hope also insightful. Now, there's no question that a large part of the appeal of the Feminine Mystique was Betty Friedan's presentation of herself as just an ordinary housewife. In her words, I too embraced and lived that feminine mystique. I lived the life of the suburban housewife that was everyone's dream at the time. But we now know that Betty Friedan was far from a typical housewife, despite the husband, 3 kids, and house in the suburbs. And here we owe a huge shout out to Daniel Horowitz, whose 1998 book, Betty Friedan and the Making of the Feminine Mystique, deflated that carefully crafted public persona. Working diligently through Friedan's papers at the Schlesinger Library, Horowitz found a far more complicated backstory. A brilliant Smith student who was deeply involved in left-wing causes in the late 1930s and 1940s, then a journalist who wrote for the radical labor press, including publishing pamphlets on sex discrimination in the workplace as early as 1952, and finally an accomplished and fairly prolific freelance writer. So why would Friedan want to hide her past? Partly by 1963, she had become so invested in the public persona that she had created to go along with the book that it was hard to let go. And I've faced a similar situation in my recent book about Billie Jean King, when I called her on her often repeated and totally false claim to have lobbied for Title IX. She supports the ideas behind Title IX, but she did not lobby for it in 1972. Horowitz offers a different and deeper reason for Friedan's unease with her past. He attributes it to the chilling effect of McCarthyism in the 1950s, which made all left-wing radical activity seem suspect because of its supposed connections to communism at the height of the Cold War. Horowitz never came close to calling Friedan a communist, but she angrily accused him of red-baiting her, which is a telling choice of words, which shows how deep these scars still were 40 years after the fact. And in public and private, Friedan attacked Horowitz's conclusions and forbid him to quote from her unpublished papers. And there's this whole kind of mystery of why, if she wanted to hide her past, would she deposit all these papers at the Schlesinger Library where anybody can go use them, and then when he wanted to quote from them, she backs off and says, no, you can't do direct quotes, so he had to paraphrase them. So there's clearly a kind of push-pull here, but in the end, certainly by the 90s, she once again did not want to have anybody challenging her view of who she was. But then you may ask, well, why does it matter whether she was involved in left-wing politics when she was younger? Well, here's why it does. Instead of allowing us to think that the feminine mystique emerged totally out of the blue in the early 1960s. She once said, when some of the publicity, I had never been particularly interested in women's problems. This is the woman who had written a pamphlet on sex discrimination in the workplace in 1952. But her career shows an important link between progressive and left-wing causes in the Popular Front years of the 1930s and World War II, and the eventual revival of feminism in the 1960s and beyond. For various reasons, she wanted to bury or hide that link, but most historians see it differently. To us, it makes her a much more interesting character. So if you want to learn more about her, do check out Dan Horowitz's book to find out more. But whatever the backstory, it is quite clear that publishing The Feminine Mystique changed Betty Friedan's life. In fact, it changed a lot of women's lives, so much so that an admittedly self-selected group took the time to write to Friedan themselves. Remember when people actually wrote letters? And when they wrote these letters, they shared their stories, page after page at a time. Almost 2,000 of these letters are archived at the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe, and as you can imagine, they offer a fascinating window on women's lives circa 1963. Now, the letters break down into fairly predictable categories, starting with the "it changed my life" variety, where women told of staying up all night to finish the book and then literally the next morning deciding to go back to school or get a job. On the opposite side of the spectrum were letters from those who were deeply offended by what she said about women's traditional roles. Hogwash was a familiar epigram. And intriguingly, in the middle were a range of women who were living the suburban lifestyle she described, well aware of its frustrations and limits, but still happy and fulfilled, juggling their various roles. To my surprise, those were the women I was most drawn to as I read, mainly for the humor and self-awareness with which they surveyed their lives. But what really stumped me was that there was no way I could predict which camp a letter writer would end up in based on factors like age, how much education she'd had, the number of children she had, or what part of the country she lived in, urban, rural, suburban. So it was clearly something deeper, something more idiosyncratic and personal that made Friedan's message click for some women, for many women, and not for others. And to my regret, I never figured out how to crack that code. And at one point, I had hoped to publish a selection of these letters timed to this anniversary, but I ended up abandoning the project for several reasons, not the least of which were issues of copyright and intellectual property that would have required that I secure permission from each letter writer or her heirs, which would have meant tracking down hundreds of women 50 years later with only a name and address from 1963 to go on. But that wasn't the only reason. Fascinating and articulate as these letters were, and I loved reading them, and you can go up to the library and read them yourselves, I couldn't figure out how to make them tell a story. There just wasn't enough drama or suspense. But having said that, what I wouldn't give now to know how all of their lives turned out. I suspect that very few went through totally life-altering epiphanies, and that for most it was a process of incremental, small-scale change that added up over a lifetime. And that is one reason why it is so difficult to precisely pinpoint the impact of a single book. Now, that never kept Betty Friedan, who was possessed of a rather hefty ego, from taking credit for what she said the Feminine Mystique accomplished, in her framing, basically causing the women's movement. Now, this is clearly inaccurate on many levels. First, as pointed out earlier, one of the reasons the book did so well was that it picked up on ideas that were already out there in popular culture. Her packaging and presentation were new, but the ideas were not. And second, the book is far from a call for political action, except in the chapter on history, which I learned when I talk to people about it as one that they often have skipped when they read it the first time. Politics and civil rights are not mentioned at all. Instead, the focus is on what Friedan called, quote, a problem of identity, a stunting or evasion of growth that is perpetuated by the feminine mystique, end of quote. And in many ways, I think perhaps the best way to one of the best ways to characterize this book is as one of the first self-help books that now flood popular culture. And this is the important context, there was already a lot going on in terms of the politicization of women's issues. Case in point, the Presidential Commission on the Status of Women, convened by President John F. Kennedy in 1961 and chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt until her death a year later. The commission was just about to release its own report on the status of women in the United States. Many of its recommendations seem very tame today, but it began the process of putting women's issues on the national agenda for the first time, really, since suffrage was won in 1920. And if any of you are familiar with Gail Collins's book, When Everything Changed, she does a great job of showing how accepted and unrecognized what seemed to us egregious examples of sex discrimination were in the early 1960s, like not being able to wear pants in public. Where would we all be? Being unable to get a credit card if you were married in your own name, if you were employed, or being barred from professional schools by quotas that arbitrarily limited women's enrollment to 5%, no matter how good their grades. By 1963, things were already slowly, tentatively beginning to change. To its credit, a best-selling popular book like The Feminine Mystique also played a powerful role in disseminating these new ideas, but it is best seen as one player in a much wider cast of characters that provided the background for the flowering of feminism in the 1960s and 70s. Now, throughout this talk, I've been using the term feminism in a rather unitary fashion, whereas any of you who have ever taken or taught Women's and Gender Studies 101 know that feminism is indeed a contested and complicated term to deploy. So I would like to finish by looking at the kind of feminism the feminine mystique represented and its implications for understanding both the explosive growth of the women's movement in the 1960s and 70s, as well as its fate since then. More specifically, what is the role of popular or mainstream feminism in the broader spectrum of feminist theory and praxis? Now, I haven't gone back and done a keyword search, but I suspect that the word feminism does not actually appear all that often in the feminine mystique, despite the fact that we see it now as a key feminist text. The main thrust of the book, as I mentioned earlier, is about identity and personal growth. Friedan helped point out the problems with forceful examples and hard-hitting prose, but she left it up to individual women to figure out how to reshape their lives. And this emphasis on individualism is, of course, a cherished American tenet. And it is no accident that Friedan frames her argument in ways that draw on that intellectual tradition. But as many before me have pointed out, this focus puts the burden on individuals to change and does little to challenge the broader societal structures that limited them in the first place. Returning to the way that Friedan left out African American and working class women, how useful is a message of just do it, with apologies to Nike, when your life choices and options are circumscribed by factors such as race and class, in addition to gender. And I think that this focus on individual growth and a lack of attention to institutional and political constraints is one reason why Friedan was never able to write the sequel to The Feminine Mystique that she planned and was actually under contract for. No doubt foreshadowed by the wishy-washy final chapter on a new life plan for women, Friedan lacked the vocabulary or the vision to articulate a blueprint for women's new lives except in the most general terms. Her role, and we should not underestimate it, was as a provocateur, as the instigator of a broad national conversation about a topic, women, that had literally dropped off the national agenda. But she stumbled over the what next question. So it's interesting that just 3 years after the book's publication, Friedan is involved in the founding of the National Organization for Women. The story is a familiar one. Activists had gathered in Washington, D.C. in 1966 for a meeting of the state commissions on the status of women that were the offshoot of the Kennedy Commission. Assembled there, they began to voice frustration about the slow progress implementing the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which banned sex as well as race discrimination at work. Why, they asked, wasn't the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission taking women's complaints about sex discrimination as seriously as those filed by African American men? Adjourning to Betty Friedan's hotel room, the women began to talk about creating a civil rights organization for women modeled on the NAACP, and that eventually became NOW. And Betty Friedan served as its first president from 1966 to 1970. The National Organization for Women is a prime example of mainstream or liberal feminism. In fact, its charter explicitly called for the inclusion of women, quote, into full participation in the mainstream of American society now, end of quote. Stressing tenets like political and civil rights, equal opportunity, and a full partnership between the sexes, it aimed to give women the same privileges and rights as men in civil society. Rather than challenging the system, it asks for women's full inclusion into it. This is why it's sometimes called Me Too or piece of the pie feminism. What a contrast, of course, to the vibrant women's liberation movement also emerging in the mid-1960s that had a far more radical agenda for attacking patriarchy and dismantling sexism. So true confession time, I've always had a certain love-hate relationship with liberal feminism, which is very much on display in my biographies of Amelia Earhart and Billie Jean King. I understand the appeal of their popular approach in periods with or without an active feminist movement. And I find compelling their allegiance to a vision of political and social change that foregrounds concepts like equal opportunity and fairness as applied to women. And yet at times I get frustrated with how little they are willing to push and how unwilling American citizens are to truly grapple with the profound and far-reaching implications of feminist analysis. But in the end, I think these popularizers play a vital role in translating the powerful and complex ideas of modern feminism into terms that can reach and influence a broad citizenry that is not likely to read the latest tomes in feminist theory. And I would put Betty Friedan in that category. She also filled an important role in that she served as the public face for the emerging women's movement. The media needs and loves to anoint celebrities or stars as spokespersons for causes. Just think of how Gloria Steinem came to stand in the popular mind for second-wave feminism, and how the media anointed Phyllis Schlafly as the embodiment of conservative women. Betty Friedan eagerly stepped into a similar role as a spokesperson for popular feminism, and she basically remained there until her death in 2006. Now, as we contemplate the feminine mystique at 50, I would like to end with a 1965 letter to Betty Friedan that speaks to many of the themes I've been exploring. It comes from a 22-year-old aspiring Republican politician in San Antonio, Texas. Even though she was not a bored housewife, she was single and she had what she called a career job. She heartily thanked Friedan for, quote, releasing me from the pressures I didn't know existed until I read your book, end of quote. But as she mapped out her plans for the future, she struggled to pinpoint precisely what role the book had played. Continuing the quote, there is a problem here I must decide, she wrote Friedan, what your book really meant to me. I am trying to determine if your book was the beginning of moving beyond the feminine mystique, or if I already believed the basics behind your book and your book merely supported and gave clarity and logic to those beliefs. Very good question, and one that goes to the heart of how we assess the impact of this 1963 book. As Betty Friedan herself said in 1966, I did not set out consciously to start a revolution when I wrote The Feminine Mystique, but it changed my life as a woman and as a writer, and other women tell me it changed theirs. I have had to take the responsibility for the revolution my words helped start. A bit overblown, but not all that far off the mark, especially if we highlight the words helped start. And 50 years later, I think the way we can best honor the legacy of a pioneering feminist and her provocative and still timely book is by continuing the conversation, each of us carrying the torch of feminism forward in our own individual way. Thank you. I'm happy to answer questions or comment more. Yeah.
Since she obviously became an activist in the founding of NOW and working in the political arena, why do you think she omitted that
from the book and just left the sort of the personal solutions and did not? Why do you think she left the political part out?
I think there are two answers to that. One, I think her training in psychology is really important. I mean, she went off to graduate school at Berkeley after Smith. And so the way she has of framing issues and problems is looking at questions of individual identity. So that's one reason. The other, I think, is this clear determination she had to pitch the book to the widest popular audience. And at the Schlesinger Library, you see draft after draft after draft of the book, and it gets, the more complex areas get left out. Now but my sense is that the political was really never there. That wasn't on her agenda. And it is especially interesting since early in her career, that was the whole focus of her activism. And so again, there is this shift that happens in the 1950s. But my sense is that in the end, this book was very much a product of the book she thought would sell the most. And she was at peace with the corner she had to cut to do that. Yeah.
I think those 2 points are really very clear and very interesting. I didn't know anything about her early political activity, but I think that you're right, she wanted to write a book that would be a huge success. That was very clear, but I think it's very hard to understand how much people were scarred by the blacklist. And we never learned anything about it in my generation in school. I had to educate myself about it because they were even afraid to teach it to the baby boom. And once I learned about it, I walked around where I worked and asked people if they had signed loyalty oaths, and many of the people older than me had actually had to swear allegiance to the United States to get a job, you know, and people were terrified. I mean, they were terrorized. And you didn't even have to be a communist. You could just be against segregation or against nuclear testing, and you could get blacklisted. So I'm sure she was quite terrorized and burnt by that to the point where she just didn't want anything to do with politics. If she had been political earlier on, it was quite a nasty business. But still, it sounds like you're right. She was looking to be a commercial success.
Yeah.
Just very quickly,
Oh.
I would like to back up that people were very, very frightened. And I'm sure that had a lot to do with her having to decide how she could still lead a public life and influence people in any way.
Yeah. Over here, there was some, yeah. You, yes.
Earlier we saw the movie Some American Feminists, and what I found very interesting in the movie was most of the other women that were being interviewed seemed a little bit disappointed that the movement was stalling. But Betty Friedan's commentary was very hopeful. And what I'm finding very interesting in that hopefulness is just in the same way that the book is trying to capture one specific audience and to get them fired up, is that this really was about capturing the imagination. And if we take a look at women that are in their 20s now as compared to women now, like myself, that are in their 40s, there are some jobs that I would have not thought that I could have gotten. That women now, there's nothing that they don't think they can achieve. We've captured imaginations, and we've also gone past the point where we doubt that it ever wasn't possible. And I think it's very interesting because her whole tone seemed to be extremely hopeful in not a political way, at least from her commentary there, but more of, I want to spark that thought so that we never go back to thinking it's not possible.
Yeah, well, I think that's another thing it's very hard for us to imagine now, the way that women were encouraged to doubt themselves and their capabilities. They didn't get much societal support if they wanted to think big. And that's where there's actually a good match between her kind of individual self-help and encouraging people to dream. The other part of me just keeps thinking, but there are all these barriers. And I think that's the challenge that feminism has been trying to confront over the last 50 years. It's the individual change, and it's the societal barriers and the relation between the two. And we haven't quite gotten there yet, but I do think we need to remember how much has changed. I mean, I just think about the profound amount of change in women's lives just in my lifetime. And I think that is an important takeaway point at this moment, 50 years out.
I think actually, we need to move to the reception now. It's almost 7 o'clock. Please feel free to come to the reception and ask
Talk to me.
Susan.